I was in Rwanda in December 2019. And so today, at Audrey's invitation, I'm going to try to present to you over the next 2 hours, kind of what we're calling advanced debate, or more advanced argumentation training and things like that. These are things that I would cover in my college argumentation and debate classes. And in fact, I'm teaching one starting next week for SMU students here in Dallas, Texas, and things like that. I was going to say a little bit, and you all can still see my slides. Is that right? Okay.
We can
We can.
Good. And feel free to stop me at any point, or also put things in the chat if you have questions as we're going along. That's not going to bother me if you kind of stop me or anything like that. So, but I'm going to kind of go through these slides and try to help you all become even better debaters, and maybe look into some deeper skills than we usually get to. This is just a slide kind of about kind of the history of working with Debate Rwanda and things like that, which really is one of my favorite groups in the world for debate. And on the left, that's actually the first book. I've written 4 academic books, and they're all primarily about debate and the good things that can happen because of debate. So, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. This is actually a photo from the Kigali Public Library when I was working with high school teachers, trying to teach them to do debate back in December 2019. They actually did a really nice job of debating whether Rwanda should have a one-child policy. So we may look at some sample resolutions. That was one that they debated. And then I think this photo, I think Nej might have been in this photo somewhere. She might be outside the frame here, but this was what I called the Mustang class in December of 2019 when we were out in, I think it was Eastern Rwanda for that camp in person. People are in this photo are holding up the Coolidge debate stickers that I brought with me. I am the Calvin Coolidge Debate Fellow, which is a special debate championship for high school students. We actually, Audrey and Teta actually qualified for this in 2019, and we've been struggling to get the 2 of them over here to the US to debate in Vermont. That's where the Coolidge Foundation is. And this is some of the kind of championship photos from that workshop that we did back in December 2019. And as I said, I've done a lot of publishing, and based on that 2019, I published this latest book called Debate as Global Pedagogy, Rwanda Rising. And it's mainly about young people like you and incredible things that are happening in Rwanda because of debate. I think you all embody the future, not only of Rwanda, but probably the continent of Africa. I think Rwanda is a great continental leader for other nations in the region. You know, and y'all know this, that even when we did the debate camp in 2019, there were people from other countries, especially Uganda, that came and got instruction and benefit from your experiences. As a couple of you, several of you I've been talking to this morning already, y'all have, 5 years of debate experience, and that's actually quite a bit, and things like that. So, but I've worked with a lot of different organizations. I've worked with the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I've worked with President Bush here in Dallas. He has a library on our campus at Southern Methodist University. But my number one love is debate, and that's mainly what I'm, writing and teaching about all the time. And you're really improving your future by being involved in debate, studying it, and learning more, and that kind of thing. So these are just kind of 4 introductory slides to kind of give you a little bit of familiarity with what I do and kind of what my connection has been with Rwanda and things like that. And by the way, I didn't put it in the slide, but I actually came to Rwanda in 2017 2017 was actually the first time I'd ever been outside the United States. And I always like to say, and it's true, that the first country I went to was Rwanda. And that's because Rwanda is probably my favorite country in the whole world. So I just love what you all are doing. And I think it's really exciting. So I'm going to pause there just for a moment. Does anybody have a question about the things that I was saying, kind of about what I do and kind of my identification and that kind of thing? Or anybody have a question already? All right, well, I'm not hearing any questions, so I'm going to keep going here. And so that's totally fine. In terms of here in the United States, our debate program here at Southern Methodist University has won 10 national championships since 2010. So in the last 10 years, we've won 10 national championships. They're kind of listed there. You can see several of the students, little photos of them on the left side, but all the way from novice debate to varsity debate, we've had top national champions and things like that. And also in different types of debate. And we may want to talk about what the different types of debate are. I know that you all in Rwanda tend to do a lot of world schools format debating. When I talk this morning, I'm going to be talking mainly just in generic terms, regardless of what format you use to debate. But that IPDA label, IPDA, stands for International Public Debate Association. And that's the league that we primarily debate in and with here at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. So I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of really great students. And then with debate, they go on and do some really great things that, I think you all are going to prove to be really excellent leaders for Rwanda and really, I think, for the world. And if I'm lucky, maybe even here in the United States. I'd love to have as many of y'all here in the United States, maybe even here at SMU or something like that, debating. So be sure to talk to me about that if you ever think you're interested. I'm going to have the contact information on the last slide here at the end of our time. So I want to go ahead and try to get into some instructional content. These are all kind of things just to kind of set up and hopefully get you to trust and believe that you can listen to me talking about debate, that I've done this for, actually, I've been a coach for 30 years. So a long, long time across the United States and even around the world, I've done these kind of things. I did want to show you kind of a teaching philosophy slide. And I don't know if it's super clear, but you've kind of got that purple axis and the orange axis, and those are kind of like an XY axis. But the simple thing that this slide is trying to show you is that I'm a fiercely idealistic person, which is to say, I really believe people can overcome difficult circumstances and challenges and do great things. And so my perspective on teaching debate is that it really fulfills, and I did not put this on a slide, but the specific teaching mission that I have, which is to equip individuals to have their voice. So I think every person on the planet ought to be able to express themselves and talk and argue. And if we make that happen through proper teaching and instruction, then the world's going to be a better place, because even at a theological level, I think God has made every person to contribute something in the world that they live in. And so I'm hoping that by the end of the time this afternoon, that you all will be a little bit better at expressing your voices. And I think that's really important. So I sort of joked, and I say to all the students I work with, and I'll say this next week when we start classes, and I want to say it to you all this afternoon in Rwanda, that I'm cynical about one thing: cynicism. Okay. And so I want to be really positive. I want you to be positive. And that means that, even if you lose a debate, even if you lose a lot of debates, it's okay. Anybody who's doing debate and trying to get better at it is really making themselves better and actually making the world better. I sometimes like to use the example, and in fact, I've got a picture here on my desk. I'm going to go ahead and just grab this. This is actually a picture of my daughter, Sarah. She actually has a disability called cerebral palsy. And so it affects her ability to walk a little bit. It also has given her a lot of challenges mentally. But as a disabled person, I'm better able to advocate for her in her schools and for her teachers to kind of treat her better and things like that, because of the training that I had in debate. And so even though, you know, a lot of what we'll do is focusing on awards or trophies and things like that, the abilities you all are getting in debate are going to help the people that you love and care about, because you're going to be able to help them and advocate for them, sort of like I advocate for my daughter, Sarah, more effectively. And so that's what causes Rwanda and every place that you ever travel to or engage with to be a better place, because you're a better advocate and things like that. So I hope that you adopt and already have a similarly idealistic perspective about why you're learning to argue. Because again, I want to be honest, I think people can be cynical. I think people can engage in argument for wrong ethical reasons. They just want to get things for themselves selfishly. They want to take things away from other people. And those are not great reasons to be debating and arguing. And we need to be good at arguing, actually, so that we can be wary, quite honestly, or careful of people with bad motives who learn argument. And, you know, it's interesting that when I was in Rwanda in 2019, I was at a Catholic high school, and the teachers were asking me about debate, kind of in an instruction like this. And they were saying, you know, how can we be sure, you know, Professor Voth, that when people learn argument, that they don't use argument skills to do bad things or argue for bad things? And maybe we're just going to teach students and then they're going to say false things or untrue things. And I said, well, you know, you can worry about that as teachers, especially at the Catholic high school, but you can also worry that if you don't train your students in how to defend the truth and good things with argument, how much more vulnerable are they going to be to those kind of tricks and deceptions and things like that? And I think the high school teachers there were really nodding their head when I said that. So we need, you know, good and ethical people to learn how to argue so that what is good and right and true can be defended and things like that. So I don't know, any question or comment about that kind of philosophical point? Or okay, well, let's continue. I will tell you, and some of you may have heard some of these explanations, but our debate program here in the United States at SMU, Southern Methodist University, is based a lot upon this person, James Farmer Jr. And James Farmer Jr. actually trained Martin Luther King in the methods that are sort of famous worldwide about nonviolent civil disobedience and things like that. Before Martin Luther King, there was a man from Texas who his nickname was the Great Debater. And in fact, you should have seen it on a slide, but I wrote an entire book about him. And there's also a really excellent movie by Denzel Washington called The Great Debaters. I highly recommend it if you've never seen that movie. But our debate program is modeled after him and trying to make great debaters like James Farmer Jr. He was actually born not very far from here in Texas. But he worked with American presidents like Richard Nixon and Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was very important to passing some of the most critical civil rights legislation that protected Blacks from discrimination in the United States. When he graduated from college, his dad said, "What do you want to do with your college education?" And he rather famously said in 1942, "I want to destroy segregation." And segregation was a very specific legal practice in the United States that unfortunately kept Black people, African Americans, from joining in things like education or even businesses and things like that at an equal level. And over a 25-year period from 1942, when he had that conversation with his dad about graduating college, and 1967, he did actually destroy segregation in the United States. And so you may have heard of, you know, in the United States, there used to be like water fountains, places where you could get a drink of water, and it would be labeled whites only on one water fountain, and then on another water fountain, it would say blacks only. He destroyed all of that with the help of people like Martin Luther King, who are more famous. But James Farmer is probably one of the most famous debate people in the United States and in the history of the United States. They did borrow from, of course, his Christian background as a Methodist, but also they borrowed some things from Gandhi in India, and they worked. He was actually friends with a sort of famous advocate, Malcolm X. Maybe you've heard of Malcolm X. They actually debated each other 4 times in the United States. There was a famous debate at Cornell University in 1962 between the two men. So debate allowed him to form friendships with a lot of different people, even people that really disagreed with him. But that's one of those important good things about debate. You learn to disagree with another person without disliking the person. And that can be one of the most beneficial things that debate can do for individuals and for society at large. And obviously, Rwanda has this incredible story of overcoming genocide in 1994, where people disagreed so strongly and so hatefully that there was so much killing. And that's what my most recent book about you all kind of got into. But now there's a lot of incredibly good things happening. And I think a lot of it is because of you all as I would say, great debaters in Rwanda. So let's see. I'm looking at a question here from Audrey that says, when you talk about having a reason to debate, does that exclude people who started debate from just an activity they have been assigned from being attached to the growth one may receive while debating? I don't think I would ever want to exclude anybody in terms of debating. And there are a lot of different people doing debate for a lot of different reasons. And your question, I think, Audrey, highlights that sometimes they're just doing it. In fact, like I said, next week they're going to be doing that here in Dallas for me. They're just assigned in a class to do it. Some people are doing it, we might say, at a less serious level, like they don't go to tournaments or something like that. But I think that everybody who does even a little bit of debate is actually gaining benefits from it. The school where James Farmer went to college is a college called Wiley College. One of the things in that new book that I was mentioning about you all, there's actually a chapter in here about something that is called HBCUs. These are historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. But there's a chapter about, sort of like I think what you're asking about, Audrey, where people only did debate like in a chemistry class or a history class, like one assignment, they did debate. But the incredible thing is that the studies on that found that just doing like one in-class debate raised their critical thinking scores by record amounts. And we actually published that research in that book that I was just showing you. So even a little bit of debate is going to make a really big difference to people. So I don't think anybody, and I don't know kind of where everybody's coming from on this call today, but even if you've never done debate before, or you've only done a little bit, or you look at somebody else and say, well, they're a lot more serious about this than me, you can get a lot of benefit out of studying and thinking about argumentation and debate as we're talking about it today. So let me just double check. Am I answering your question, Audrey, or is there something more you want to say about your question?
Yeah, you just answered it very well. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. My question was maybe focusing on people who have just joined debate and they don't really have that big of a reason to be there. And do they also have space for growth when it comes to debating? But you just answered it well. Thank you.
Yeah, and I definitely think they do. And that's one of the things that I think for those of us that are debate coaches and people encouraging debate, we need to be careful that we're doing exactly what you're describing, trying to get as many people in a society exposed to debate, even if it's just a little tiny bit. Maybe these are maybe little young kids who are like, 10 or 12 years old. I think you can start doing little debates and get big benefits. And in fact, and y'all probably know this if you remember back when you first started debating, that you actually learn more about debate probably in the first, month than you do like in the later times of your debate career. So people who first encounter debate are really getting a huge benefit. I did want to show you in terms of this kind of heroic person, James Farmer Jr. He learned debate from this person Melvin Tolson. And really all of you, I think on this call who are taking time to learn advanced debate, all of you are going to be able to coach other people. And some of you probably already have done that, but this is actually a photo of that coach's home. He has died and passed away some time ago, but we learn debate from coaches and things like that, and then they can have a really important legacy as those debaters grow up and become important people within a society. And Melvin Tolson is a debate coach who really did teach some amazing and important people that affected some Supreme Court cases in the United States. And obviously, as I was saying, James Farmer Jr. was one of the most important civil rights leaders in the United States, right alongside, but actually before Martin Luther King. And it's interesting to think about how that started with someone coaching another person in debate. And so I would invite you and encourage you all, and I know you all do this. I mean, y'all were fantastic assistants when I was in Rwanda at that debate camp in December. I think there were more than 30 of you all as debate camp staff who were helping us carry it out. And I mean, it was just amazing. So as you learn debate, you can turn around and teach somebody else debate and really change their lives. So that's really amazing. All right, well, let me go ahead and step forward here. And now I want to kind of get into some sort of practical elements of like, how do we do debate? How do we do well? We've covered about 30 minutes of time here, but I want to now start getting into the substantive elements. And now I will say, in order to get into the advanced things, I want to make sure I clarify what the basic things are. These are things that, again, if somebody was starting on debate, we want to make sure that they understand. And I would say that there's 4 basic elements to debate. And again, a lot of the students I'm going to have next week for class, for this college class, they will never have debated before. And I'll have to explain that there's, first of all, a resolution. And so let me just kind of throw out there, can somebody on this call give me an example of a debate resolution that you've debated or you're about to debate? Anybody think of one?
Okay, we once debated this resolution, like COVID-19 vaccines should be made mandatory.
Okay, that's a perfect example, Benjamin. Thank you. So resolved, COVID vaccine should be mandatory. So that there has to be a topic, and sometimes this is described as a proposition. When you go kind of, and especially in, well, really all over the world, the words that are used they kind of vary. There's kind of an American style of language that says resolution. There's more of a British style that says proposition. Another word that might be used or synonym is a topic. But in order to initially start a debate, there needs to be a resolution. Now, one of the things I'm going to be talking about later in this call is a very special advanced argument called topicality, and that is derived from understanding the resolution. And we have to be careful when we're debate coaches or debate planners that we set up a resolution that's fair. If I say resolve that, this is a pen for writing, that's not really very debatable. I mean, it really is a pen, and it would be hard to argue that it's something else. So that wouldn't be a fair or good resolution. So we like to say that there's equal opportunity for the two sides in the debate to win. And again, sometimes it's called the proposition and the opposition. In the United States, it's often called affirmative and negative, but there's two sides, and the resolution needs to be fair to both sides. Both sides could win the debate. A person listening would be receptive to arguments on both sides. And so, like, I know, for example, Audrey did a demonstration debate for us for the Coolidge Cup this summer about US tax policy. And it was, she did a really great job, a really great demonstration. But both sides were able to illustrate why we should or should not change the US tax code in this past July. So that was really good. So that's the first starting point for having a debate, is we have a topic about which somebody could disagree. There might be 2 people debating 2 people. In world schools, there might be 3 people debating 3 people. And sometimes there's 1 person debating 1 person. So, but you've got to have a resolution to start. The second thing that I think is important in a debate are the time limits. And again, in different formats of debate, these vary. Typically, there are longer speeches at the beginning of a debate, and then there are shorter, what are called rebuttal speeches at the end of the debate. And we need to understand that there's kind of a natural funneling process where the number of arguments being discussed in a debate gets smaller, and you have to think more carefully about what are the important things because of the time limits. And if there were not time limits, then people would just talk endlessly. There would be kind of what we in the United States sometimes call filibuster, and there wouldn't be an end to the debate. It would just keep going and going and going. So, and you can change when you're a teacher, like when I only have maybe like a 1-hour time period, I might change the time limits so that my students can have a debate, but it's equal. And I give the same amount of time to both sides so that that makes the debate fair. So time limits are important. The third element of a debate is that there's advocates for both sides. There's someone who agrees with the resolution and there's someone who disagrees with the resolution. And as I've already said, there are sometimes different labels. I think in European and even African context, there's often the term proposition and opposition. Sometimes it's like this house or the government, which we would say is in favor of the resolution. Those words kind of come up. And then there's the opposition. And in America, we often use the term negative to describe that side. But, you know, there's also in trial settings like a prosecution and a defense. So there are those, you know, 2 sides. So it's important that there be 2 sides debating for there actually to be a debate. And then the last thing and the final element is the basis for decision, or a judge. There's going to be a judge who makes a decision and they vote for the resolution or against the resolution based on the arguments that were presented. So those are the 4 essential ingredients to a debate. If you have those 4 elements, then you have a debate. And then notice that that is actually different than having an argument. You and I could have an argument, but if it didn't have any time limits, it would just kind of go and go and go and go. But with time limits, the debate will come to an end and we'll get to maybe have another debate later because we have time limits. So that's important. So those are the basic things. I would guess that everybody who's got debate experience knows what these things are. But does anybody have a question about the basic things of a debate? All right, well, I'm not seeing questions about that. I'm going to move on to this next part. And this is where I think things get a lot more advanced in terms of argumentation training, but especially in the United States, but really maybe even worldwide, one of the biggest theories of argument is something known as the Toolman Model. And so I want to spend a lot of time this afternoon talking through the Toolman Model, because it's a very powerful analytic tool for advanced debaters to examine arguments in a debate and try to convince the judge that they are correct. And there is a researcher back in the 1950s in Britain who wrote a book called The Uses of Argument. And the uses of argument established this Toolman model, which is a graphical, in other words, kind of like a picture. It's like taking a picture of what an argument would look like. And it has 6 elements. And I'm going to go through the 6 elements of an argument as observed by Stephen Toulmin. So you're going to see these kind of balls kind of bounce onto the screen here on my slides. And the first 3 elements are what Stephen Toulmin says are essential to an argument. In other words, if these things are not present, these 3 things, then there's not an argument. And the first thing that you see bounce onto the screen here is called data. Another simple way we might say this is evidence. The British sometimes use a word called grounds. So if you were actually to open an old book from Stephen Toulmin, it might have the word grounds in it. but it's a basis, it's information that says, like if we were debating that COVID vaccine should be mandatory, you might have some data that says the Pfizer vaccine reduces the likelihood of contracting the virus by 65%. Like if you had some medical research from a medical journal that stated that fact, that would be data, okay? And you would use that to perhaps argue that the vaccine should be mandatory. So whenever you do that research and you provide some evidence, that's called data. And that's step one in forming an argument. But let's take a look at the second item, which is the claim. So on the right side of the screen, you see the word claim. And the claim is basically the conclusion that you want the audience to accept. So if I present some data that says the Pfizer vaccine reduces the likelihood of getting the virus by 65%, therefore, I think the government of Rwanda should make vaccines like the Pfizer vaccine mandatory. That's my claim. That's the conclusion that I want the judge and any audience watching the debate to agree with me about. So those two things kind of have to work together in order to have an argument. Now, those two things are probably very intuitive. You probably knew that in a certain sense if you'd done any debating at all. But what I also put on the screen here is the third thing, and it's at the bottom of the screen, and this is the most complicated part of the model, is the warrant, okay? And I've added these bars to indicate how these three things are connected mentally or in your brain in order to make an argument. And the third and final part, and this is the most complicated part, is the warrant. The warrant, I don't know if y'all use this term with your police or something like that, but in the United States, a police officer might have a warrant to go arrest someone. And like maybe they broke a law. So, the police come to your house, the person being arrested, like, where's your warrant? Like you have, like a piece of paper that shows why I'm being arrested. Well, sort of like that. In argument, there needs to be a reason that the data and the claim are connected. And that reason that the data and the claim are connected is what's called the warrant. All right. And if you can understand this, this is one of the most advanced argumentation theories. College professors in the United States use this a lot. A lot of English teachers use this to teach writing in order to teach how to create an effective essay. But let me kind of give you an example where an argument does not have a warrant. Okay, if I said this pen is orange on the end, and I think we could probably agree about that. We could say like, okay, that's orange, and we can see that, and I have some data. Therefore, Dr. Voth should go to Rwanda and teach more debate classes. And I make that claim, that actually doesn't really make sense. Just because this pen has an orange cap on it doesn't really have a reason or a logical connection to lead me to say, therefore, I should teach more classes. Similarly, if I said, 25% of people in Rwanda own a car, therefore the government should adopt mandatory vaccines. That's kind of illogical. Why am I saying that one random fact and this claim together? In something known as fallacies, there's a Latin term that's used sometimes called non sequitur, okay? And which means it does not follow, it's not logical, all right? But if I said, as I said earlier, that the Pfizer vaccine reduces the risk of getting the COVID virus by 65%, therefore the government of Rwanda should adopt mandatory vaccine policies, the warrant for that is that something which reduces the incidence of disease is a good reason for making something mandatory. It's logical. It makes sense that, you know, if something is effective in preventing disease, that it's desirable. So when we understand the warrant, we understand the complete argument. So knowing what the warrants are is sort of the tricky skill of advanced debaters. And that's kind of one of the biggest things I want to try to communicate to you this afternoon, is to think about what are the warrants. And sometimes debaters will say in debates, advanced debaters will say, there's no warrant for your argument. And in other words, you're saying to that person, that's not logical what you just said in your last speech, okay? And that's kind of harsh, but it's a way of rejecting an opponent's argument by saying, or even asking them in maybe a point of information or in cross-examination saying, what is the warrant? Why do you make that claim in relation to that evidence? Is that necessarily true? You know, and somebody might say, even with what I said about the vaccine being very effective, that they might say, well, that doesn't mean it should be mandatory. Maybe that means it should be an option, but maybe people shouldn't be forced to do that. Maybe I haven't really justified the word mandatory, okay? And that might be a good question to kind of to ask there. So warrant analysis is really important to effective, high quality, high level debating. So, and notice, and this may have kind of gotten by you, the warrant is not usually stated by the debater. It's something that's understood in the mind of the audience. They kind of say, aha, that makes sense. What those two things together make sense. And the audience member, the judge, provides that. But you better understand, you know, the mind of the audience before you go and argue in front of them. This model is very important in terms of what we talk about audience adaptation. All right, adjusting your arguments to your judge, because what warrants are they going to make? All right. And so, you know, and this is almost silly to say, but, you know, in America, we're having a lot of discussion about the situation in Afghanistan right now. And if I were making arguments about, you know, what the United States needs to do to defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan, if for some reason I had a judge who was in the Taliban, a lot of my arguments wouldn't make sense. They would not make the same mental connections that an American judge would probably make. Similarly, like if I were talking to international audiences, they might not know something about Rwanda. Like you might tell somebody something about Rwanda, but they don't know a lot about Rwanda. Maybe they don't know that, like, yeah, in 1994, there was a genocide. So they don't connect some points that you're making because you don't understand the judge well enough to know what kind of connections they're going to make. And that's where having conversation with your judge before you start a debate can help you form the best arguments that are going to suit them and cause this mental completion of the warrant between data and claim. So I want to pause. There are still 3 more elements to this model that I want to talk through, but these are the 3 essential elements. And according to Stephen Toulmin and most argumentation and debate experts in the United States and probably even worldwide, you don't have an argument if you don't have these 3 elements present during a debate. So let me pause. Anybody have a question about those 3 items or how this might apply or? Okay. I'm not seeing or hearing any questions. I'm trusting that you're understanding this pretty well. Let's take a look at the other 3 elements in the model and be aware that these may or may not be present. According to Stephen Toulmin, he observed actually hundreds of people arguing in public to create this model that we're looking at. One optional thing that we may or may not see in an argument is modality. I'm going to explain that a little bit in a moment after I get this second item in here called qualifier. Actually, we've got all 3 of the other parts. I'm going to go ahead and put my connectors in here. So this is what the full Toolman model looks like. And you'll notice on the right side of this graphic, what's called modality and qualifier. both modality and qualifier affect the certainty of the claim. Now, on modality, I think the simple way to understand modality, if you know English grammar, is that modality is adverbs. And I don't know if you remember or know what an adverb is from high school or whatever, but an adverb, can anybody give me an example of an adverb? It's a little bit tricky, but anybody want to try?
Wonderfully.
Yes, wonderfully. Okay. So notice, and this is kind of a good tip, that the word wonderfully ends in ly. And a lot of English words, when they end in ly, we recognize them as adverbs. All right. And so maybe you would say that Rwanda should wonderfully mandate vaccines. Okay. Now that would be a little bit of a strange modification of the claim, but it is making an adjustment to the claim. More common in the way of modifying a claim is a word like probably. Sometimes the debater who's arguing will say, we should probably. And that's where you as an opponent are like, oh, so you're not saying all the time, or you think that in some cases, maybe we shouldn't do this. And you want to attend and hear, oh, you said probably, or maybe most likely. So we want to hear as a debater the modal terms that people use in debate and say, well, so you're not defending in every case. And usually if there's not a modal term, if people don't have the word probably, then they're defending it in every case. And again, we want to notice that when we're debating, like, okay, you didn't say most likely or probably. So you're saying every time, always, this is true. And that's honestly kind of difficult to defend from an argument perspective. So you want to notice whether your opponent in a debate is using modal terms or not. And those affect the certainty of the claim, the conclusion that they're trying to get the judge and the audience to accept. So we want to notice those things. And a word like wonderfully, yeah, is a good example of an adverb. Similar to modality and below it is the word qualifier. It also affects the certainty of the claim. And honestly, going back to English grammar, it typically tends to be a phrase, most specifically a prepositional phrase. So in other words, it will begin with a preposition. So we might say vaccines should be mandatory unless someone has a religious objection. Okay, unless they have a religious objection is a qualifier. And it's almost like you make a donut hole out of that claim. It's like, this claim is true, except, and in fact, you might say that word, except if someone has a medical condition that would cause a reaction with the vaccine, okay? Except, when you start that phrase with the word except, you're creating a qualifier. You're creating a condition under which you, the advocate, will not defend the claim, all right? So those are important exceptions to how the argument's going to work. And a careful debater, an advanced debater, is aware of these differences in description that can happen. And they may call attention to them, as I said before, in like a point of information or a question during cross-examination, or maybe in another speech when they comment on what the other debater did. So modality and qualifier, those are important. Finally, the sixth and final part of this model is backing. And again, this is optional. It may not appear, but backing is additional evidence that reinforces the warrant. Like you might give more examples. Like if you were saying that Rwanda should have mandatory vaccines, you might say, and I don't know if this is true, but you might say Uganda adopted mandatory vaccines 6 months ago, and they have had a lot of success fighting COVID for that reason. So if you give another example to prove the claim that you're making, those additional examples, and you might have a bunch of them, those are backing. Okay, you already gave some statistical data, but then you gave some more examples like, well, it worked in this case, and then, the United States does the same thing, Israel did the same thing. And so those additional examples would be sort of recognized as backing. And the more backing they have, kind of the harder it is to defeat the warrant of the argument being made. And again, as an advanced debater, as we're kind of contemplating here this afternoon in Rwanda, this is a theoretical insight that you might want to master in order to become the most effective debater. And so that is really the entire model. Now, I've only added in this color coding here at the end to show you that everything up at the top of this model, this graphical model, is explicit, which is to say stated. It is heard out loud by the people debating and judging. And then at the bottom of this model is the warrant, and that's the part that's inside somebody's head, okay? For example, I'm just going to give an example of how this works. I think most people, we just got done with the Olympics, and when most people are patriotic to their own country, Americans love America, Rwandans love Rwanda. But if on some rare occasion you encountered a person who was not patriotic or, anti-patriotic, like they just didn't like their home country for some reason, making a patriotic appeal to that person isn't going to work because they're not going to complete that warrant. They're not mentally thinking, hey, I love my country. And so when you say, hey, this will be good for Rwanda, so we should do it, they might say, I don't care about Rwanda. I don't like Rwanda. Or, and it makes me mad, honestly. Sometimes we have like athletes in the United States who like don't respect the flag or the anthem or things like that. And so making a patriotic appeal to them, it just won't work. So we have to know who we're talking to and who we're trying to convince and what kind of their mental habits are in order to make effective arguments. And so that's where, again, going back to the civil rights example of James Farmer and Martin Luther King, when Martin Luther King gave that famous speech, I Have a Dream, he talked about famous things in American history with the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, things that Americans would know in their mind. And he alluded to them in the speech so that he could make claims that they would agree with. So he would say, like, the Bank of Justice is not bankrupt, and so we've come here to cash a check. The Americans understood that because they knew American history and they could complete the argument that Martin Luther King was making. So the tricky thing about this model is understanding the psychology and the assumptions that judges make when they judge our debate rounds. So let me stop and just sort of ask, are there any questions about the 6 elements or any of the explanation that I gave for these items? Okay, I am not seeing or hearing any questions, so hopefully you're understanding that pretty well. Let me kind of just share some implications of the model. One of the important things is that arguments are audience dependent. So again, like, traveling around the world, I mean, certain arguments aren't going to work in India that maybe work in Rwanda. Certain arguments are going to work in the United States, but they're not going to work in Australia because of certain assumptions that people are making. And we want to try to understand those different audiences that we're speaking to in order to make our arguments work best. It's also important to understand that warrants take different forms. And in fact, when you read more advanced books and research about this, they'll talk about different types of warrants. And I don't think that's super important to understand right now, but there are many different types of warrants that connect data and claim together. And as we learn those are going to help us become more effective debaters and that kind of thing. And also, and this is almost kind of scary, but warrants vary person to person. And so even, if you're in the same country, then if that person's not like another person, easy thing, men and women sometimes look at things differently. And so you might say things to women that you might not say to a man and vice versa. So understanding the little differences that exist between people can really help you be the best debater and the most effective at arguing. So that's some really good insight. And that's why a lot of advanced debaters, especially here in the United States, they use the Toolman model. They even use the words that I just gave you in the debate to say, well, what's your claim? What's the warrant for that? Do you have any data for your argument? You'll hear them use those three words often. And this is what they're talking about. And you may have heard that previously and not known it. Oh, that's connected to this Toolman model that Dr. Voth's talking about. And that actually comes from very specific research. So this afternoon, we've gotten in and focused in greater depth on the details of that. So that's pretty much everything that I wanted to say about the Toolman model. And that's one of the main things I wanted to cover this afternoon with you. I'm going to move on to some other parts of advanced debating. But does anybody have any lingering questions about the Toolman model or application of it before I move on to the next topic?
Dr. Ben, I meant to ask, sometimes the opposing teams or, the proposition and the opposition side have true data, but it's opposing, right? And they all meet in one same claim. And as you say, the warrant varies from person to person. How do you dodge the biasness of, the judge when it comes to how he, implies the warrant?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the issue of the bias of the judge is tricky because, and I think one thing in training judges, I do a lot of discussion of something called tabula rasa, which is to try to encourage the ideal judge to not be biased, okay? But the reality is more like what you described, is that there are biases with the judge. Now, I think when you're approaching the problem that you described, you want to discuss something known as burden of proof. In a debate, you generally talk in terms of burden of proof, that the opponent needs to prove their case. Not that it might be true, but it must be true. All right. And so talking about what the burden of proof is for your opponent can a lot of times sort of deflect the problem of bias by the judge and say, Judge, you might be inclined to agree with this statement, but you must limit yourself to what they have proven, not to what you might personally agree with or something like that. Have they proven to you? Does this data absolutely prove and things like that? So you can kind of push back against bias. But the other thing, and I'm going to be talking about this in a little bit, I think it's possible to turn arguments and even take advantage of the bias that the judge has to go the way you want to go. Okay, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's called turning an argument, where you sort of know that the judge has this disposition, but you show them how actually, if you're negative, for example, rejecting the resolution is going to do better to, for example, advance women's rights. If you know that the judge is really passionate about women's rights and wants to talk about that, then you can figure out how to reverse what the other side is saying. Does that begin to help answer your question, Audrey? Or okay, good. All right. And again, like I said, I think some points I'm going to cover later are going to add to this, but let's keep going here. Yeah, and that's actually here the next slide set. So we're going to talk about how to turn an argument. For American debaters, this is considered, I think, one of the big secrets of advanced debating. And so we want to understand this. The reason American debaters tend to use the word turn is that sometimes, and you'll hear this in lectures at debate camps in the United States, they'll talk about an argument being like a bullet kind of coming towards you. And that when you turn, and you don't want to get hit by the bullet, you don't want to be harmed by it. So in turning an argument, you reverse it and it kind of goes back at the opponent. The claim that we were just talking about, it's coming at you, it's coming at the judge, and it's going to convince, it's going to change what the judge concludes. And so before the judge accepts that, you want to try to turn the argument back. And see, this turn is a different kind of argument than what is called defensive argument. All right, and let me kind of explain the difference, because American debate coaches talk a lot about, in fact, I was reading online yesterday, some coach was asking other coaches, like, how do I train my debaters to understand the difference between defensive and offensive arguments? And again, because English can be kind of idiosyncratic, let me be clear. When I say offensive, I'm not meaning just like it's offensive ethically. I mean that it advances a strategic game goal of your debating, like helping you win, okay? Defensive arguments are not as effective at winning a debate, whereas offensive arguments are more effective at winning debates, okay? So let me kind of talk through that. If they say, you know, well, we can't do the vaccines in Rwanda because they cost too much, I might say in response to that, well, they don't cost a lot. All right, you know, actually they're not as expensive as you think. And so let's say I reduce the cost of vaccines by 25% with some evidence. That's helpful, but that's technically what debate coaches would call a defensive argument. It's kind of like, you know, if this green square represents the argument that's kind of coming, and then you tear it in half, they still have half of their argument. You've reduced it, but it's still coming at you, okay? But well, let me just ask you, can you imagine how I could turn the argument on cost? Instead of just saying it doesn't cost as much, what might I say that would be a turn to that argument? Anybody imagine anything I could say? Well, let me suggest this. What if I show that not only will the vaccine not cost money, it will save money? Okay, the vaccine is going to save money. Now, that argument that was coming at me is now going back at my opponent. It's like, oh, if we don't do the vaccine, there's going to be more cost to employers, the economy, and things like that. And, you know, you might have some evidence that says, actually, you know, when people don't get the virus, they're able to work, there's fewer fatalities, there's less people in the hospital, so you save money. So that's the key, and that's what you're going to see here in this explanation about how do you turn an argument. And you should be trying to turn all of your opponent's best arguments. And that's where, when Audrey was asking the great question earlier about, like, what about when my judge is biased, you want to sort of take advantage of their bias to kind of move the claims and arguments in your direction. So the simple thing, and I just put it on the screen there, is to reverse the verb of the opponent. If the opponent says, this is going to cost, you would hopefully be able to have evidence that says, no, it's going to save money. You know, and that's better as an argument than saying, well, it won't cost as much as you think. That's a reduction. That is a defensive argument. It ultimately probably will not convince the judge to take your side. It will only cause the judge to take your opponent's side a little bit less. But again, if they vote affirmative and you're negative, you lose. It doesn't matter if you lose by 10% or 50%. It's not going to do you any good. You've got to figure out how to reverse the verbs. You know, if they say this is healthy, you say this is toxic. If they say this increases, you say no, it decreases. Okay. Now, again, you need to be factually correct. You need to have evidence to support that. But when you mentally understand that reversing the verbs of your opponent is your best opportunity to win the debate, then you're going to win a lot more debates. And a lot of the top collegiate coaches in the United States, they spend a lot of time on this. And when you lose debates and you kind of walk away, you need to stop and think, and, you know, get your pen and kind of write down, how would I turn this argument that beat me? How would I make the opposite true? And, you know, somebody's saying like, oh, well, this is going to be really good for women. And then you say, well, it's not going to help a lot of women. If you could turn it and say, actually, this is going to hurt women. Like, for example, in the United States, and maybe it's this way in Rwanda, a lot of people will say legalizing abortion is really good for women's rights. Actually, in this book, Rhetoric of Genocide, my first book, I have a whole chapter on something called sex selection abortion. Well, that's a really interesting global practice where when abortion is legal, people almost always choose female babies to abort. And so what has happened over several decades is that we actually have millions of fewer women in the world today because of the legality of abortion. That's a turn argument to abortion. Legal abortion helps women. Like, no, actually, it reduces the number of women in the world by tens of millions. And in fact, the world's becoming more male every day because of the legality of abortion. And that's a really sort of tough argument to deal with if your judge is feminist and really believes like in women's rights, but you're coming back and saying like, look, if you legalize abortion, you're going to have a lot fewer women every day. And pretty soon, in places like China and India especially, women won't even be able to outvote men because there are going to be so many more men than women. So that's an example of turning an argument. Does everybody on the call understand the description I'm making of turning an argument?
Yeah.
Okay, good. With familiar debate judges, you'll a lot of times even hear that word said. It's a little bit of a technical term, but sometimes debaters will say, I have turned your argument. And if you hear that, that's kind of a warning. They're like, okay, I've really got something special. And if you're ever in an advanced debate round, you hear the opponent say, I just turned your argument. You know, you need to attend to that. And sort of say, no, actually my evidence is stronger on the cost or the human rights effect of this or something like that. So you're gonna need to be attentive when somebody turns an argument. But for you to be successful as a debater, you're gonna wanna try to figure out as many different ways that you can turn an argument. Now, I will point out here kind of an advanced problem that can happen here. If we kind of go back to that bullet analogy, if this is an argument and it's kind of coming at you, and I turn it and it's going back at the opponent, which that's what you want, and then I turn it again, well, now the bullet is coming back at me. Sometimes, and this is very strange, but occasionally it does happen, sometimes debaters get so excited about turning arguments that they turn them twice, okay? And then the argument, if you do that twice, then the bullet's coming back at you, and that's a problem, okay? And the joke that American debate coaches say is like, always make sure you turn the argument an odd number of times so that basically it's going back at the opponent, not coming back at you. So this is, I would say, one of the most, common turn arguments. Like, I've got an argument on the screen right now about warming and cooling. A lot of people don't know this because, there are a lot of people who argue like global warming is bad, but a turn argument, and I use this a lot in public conversations, 7 times as many people are killed by cold weather as hot weather. Okay, and that's actually a Lancet study from 2015. And so as the earth has warmed over the last 30 years at least, actually fewer people have been dying at night from exposure to the cold because temperatures are slowly going up. Whereas, I think some of you are talking about going to college where it's really hot, fewer people die from heat exhaustion than die from exposure to the cold. So that's a turn to an argument about global warming. It's like, actually, we can grow more food, we can save more people from cold nights where they die out in the open and rural areas, so on and so forth. So that's a turn argument to a global warming impact argument. Yeah, so these are just more examples on the slide of how the words would change in order to make a turn argument. But I think this is actually one of the biggest secrets in terms of advanced debating. And so those are several examples in the bottom of the slide: increase versus decrease, warming versus cooling, harming versus helpful, cost versus savings. And there are many other examples we could probably give, and maybe y'all could even think of from your own debates where you do that. But try to think more carefully about offensive arguments that will cause the argument to go back at your opponent instead of just blocking it and saying like, okay, well, that's just going to fall down. It's not real big. It's kind of smaller than you said. Those are defensive arguments, and those are not going to help you win the debates as often. So that's pretty much everything that I would say about turning an argument. Does anybody have a question or even an example they want to kind of throw out there? Or anybody confused or want to clarify about turning an argument? Okay, well, on my clock, I've got about 45 minutes left for us here, if y'all are able, and I'm going to kind of keep going here. I'm going to be shifting a little bit into kind of the research parts of debating and arguing. And I've been alluding to that a little bit anyway, even when we talk about data and evidence and ground and things like that. But oh, before I get to that though, before I get to evidence, I do want to talk a little bit about flowing debates. Okay. And let me just ask a question, and it may or may not be the case. Does anybody on this call know what flowing a debate is, or what is meant by that word flowing?
Yes, I do know that.
Can you go ahead and describe it a little bit for us, Audrey?
Okay, so for instance, in most cases, we flow the debate when you want to be able to understand what each and every speaker has brought to the table. If you're a debater, you're able to attack each and every point they brought to the table. And if you're a judge, you're able to analyze well who wins the debate or not. It's more of, you having like a piece of paper, and then you divide it in different parts, and then you're able to outline what each and every speaker has been able to talk about. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And I really do think, and I bet most of you are doing this already, but taking notes in the debate is really important. And as Audrey said, being sure that you have an accurate account of what different speakers said is critical to effective debating. Now, on the screen there, what you see is actually a schematic of a policy debate format. There are 8 speeches in US collegiate policy debate. They are signaled there in kind of pink and green columns, where the green columns represent affirmative or proposition speeches, and the pink columns represent negative or opposition speeches and things like that. And so almost like a spreadsheet on a computer, you want to have in columns kind of comparatively what are different people saying. Now, a lot of people use, and I've got a piece of it here, this is legal pad paper that's often used to flow. And you maybe already know this trick, but if you fold a piece of paper like this in half 3 times, what happens is that piece of paper, no matter how big or small, will, on the folds of the paper, will indicate 8 columns upon which you could write the arguments, okay? And you can see my paper kind of has these indentions in it now that would fit that map that you actually see on the screen of the first affirmative, the first negative, and things like that. And I could use, and notice, like the pen I have here this morning or this afternoon, it does actually have multiple colors on it. And so I might use my, red ink to flow those kind of pink columns, and I might write them into the columns and try to keep them parallel. So that's kind of the key thing that I want to stress here, is that you need to, as an advanced debater, keep track of these kind of things. So this is just a picture of kind of, again, without everything there. The yellow bars represent cross-examination in the policy debate format. You all might have points of information, but 2 or 3 minute periods sometimes happen in American debate, where you get to ask questions at the end and things like that. Audrey and Tara did examples of that in the Coolidge Cup format that is similar. So this format may not be identical to formats that you do, but no matter what happens when you're debating, you need to keep track of what they say. Now, I didn't put this on the screen, but good debaters, with their pen, need to develop kind of a shorthand that supports the language of the debate. So instead of having to write out word for word, I might write a single letter and circle it. So for example, if I'm having a debate, as we talked about today about, vaccines should be mandatory, instead of writing the word vaccines, I know I'm going to use that word a lot. So I might create the letter V and circle it. And when I see the circle letter V, I know, oh, that's the word vaccines, and it's instead of saying the word increase, I might draw an up arrow. If I hear my opponent say decrease, I might draw a down arrow. So we want to create a shorthand system so that when we do take notes, we can quickly look and say, now, Judge, they said here that vaccines increase whatever, or, Moderna or Pfizer, we want to get the details and be able to accurately represent them to the judge. So that is where note-taking is really important to effective judging and to debating. So notice at the bottom of my screen on that slide, it says the word arguments are dropped as the debate progresses, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident. The word drop is a verb that's typically used by debate coaches to describe when a debater, either by choice or maybe by accident, does not continue to make an argument during a debate. And an argument that is dropped, technically speaking, in the formal practices of debate, won't be allowed later in the debate if it was originally dropped. And if you point out to a judge, hey, Judge, they didn't make this argument in their last speech, so they've dropped it. They're not continuing that argument. Don't let them bring it back up later in the debate. That's a really strategic way to limit your opponent's ability to win the debate. And you can't really do that if you don't keep track with the notation system. And you need to be practicing and refining your shorthand for debate. And by the way, this is one of those great skills in debate that will help you take class notes in high school and college. You get better at note taking because there's limited speech time and you have to quickly respond. So you're going to learn to put little symbols that make sense out of what you are arguing in a debate. Does anybody have a question or a comment about flowing, maybe some additional advice? Like I said, y'all are very experienced and may have your own additional things to say about this, but does that make sense, Audrey?
Yeah, as a debater, it might be, totally at a certain point, you might find it impossible to flow the debate, but at the same time, trying to come up with some refutation, trying to come up with, all that stuff for you to be able to bring out the most in the debate. So what I would advise you is to, by flowing the debate, you're also answering to each and every question they bring up, right? So if they point out a certain point, you have to first off list them off, and then in their protected minute, the last minute, you'll give yourself time to respond to each and every argument. And that's how you're able to, number one, be able to fit what you have to do in the time limit, and number two, to be able to flow the debate as well. Yes, that's what I have.
Yeah, that's some really great advice from Audrey. I hope people are hearing that. And one of the things, it's kind of a small thing, but when I was kind of showing you my pen here, one of the reasons debaters like this particular type of pen is that, like I said, I use different colors, but while I'm listening to someone, I might change the colors and write down some notes for myself to say back. And I can quickly do that with this particular type of pen. Now, you may have different pens, like, I've got a red and a blue one here, and, I might have one for each team, but you can make notes for yourself coming up in the next speech or the next column of what we kind of see on the flow sheet. So that can help you be really effective, especially like, as Audrey said, like in the protected time, the last minute of a speech or something like that. So That's really good to think about. I will say, and again, this does vary from judge to judge, but I think most judges are willing to even like let a partner who's helping you like give you a note and sort of add in something to your partner where you might pick up, say, oh, wait, let me read this. There's also a point for our side, blah, 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 blah. So you can use notes written by your partner who's maybe helping you on like a world schools format. Now I see Audrey's hand on the screen, so I'm gonna let her ask a question or make a comment here.
Yeah, you're talking about using different colors, using some sticky notes and all that stuff. So if you're not able to find a sticky note or a different colored, pens, you could use a highlighter. That's what I used to use mostly. Or you could use symbols. For instance, if you're flowing, then the arguments are shown by arrows, and then your personal notes are shown by bullets, and that helps you to distinguish different parts of your notes. Yeah.
Yes, and that's so good. And that's where the thing with the note-taking system for debate, it's so variable, but by watching other people and talking to them about how do you take notes, it's really, really helpful. And lots of people have lots of clever different ways of doing it. And actually what Audrey just listed off, that's a really strategic insight. So be sure, the basic thing that needs to be said is be sure you are always taking notes in a debate, but also be working to refine it and get better at it so that you are accurately reporting to the judge. Because sometimes an opponent will say, like, Judge, they did not address point number 3, where I said such and such. They didn't address my 5th point. Well, that could be happening because you don't have an accurate record of the debate. And when you don't have an accurate record of the debate, it's really hard to meet the demands that the judge might have mentally, especially if the judge is taking notes. I would be very cautious. If you see the judge taking notes and you're not taking notes, that's going to be somewhat hazardous because the opponent's going to be able to say, well, they didn't address some of the points I made, and that's going to probably score in their favor. Now, I will say, and this is worth acknowledging, sometimes judges don't take notes. It's not always a given. And then you do need to adapt to that. Some debaters, I will say to a fault, are too committed to what's called the line by line or the number by number argument. And that's not always the most important thing, especially if the judge is not taking notes. If they're just sitting there listening, then that's a different argumentation situation than somebody where you see them out with that piece of paper and they've got that pen and they're really taking specific notes. So you adapt as a debater to whatever you find yourself doing. I will just tell you, and then Audrey, been part of this, but at the Coolidge Cup, we explained to the judges how to do this, but they haven't done it very much, so it's not a super critical thing. So they may listen a lot more than they write down and still kind of remember it, but that's going to be a different style of debating if you have a judge that's not using that pen a lot. So be aware of that. And a lot of times judges, debaters will go in and ask a judge before the debate starts, are you a flow judge? If they ask that question, they're asking, do you use notes to take care of what we're saying, or do you just try to listen carefully? And both are okay, but they're going to change the way you debate in front of the judge. Other comments or questions about flowing or taking notes on a debate? Okay, well, we've only got about half an hour left here. Let's talk about another advanced argument that's called topicality. Have any of you ever heard of topicality before as an argument?
Yes.
Anybody want to try to explain what it is?
So, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so the way I understand topicality is basically the definition of the motion, right? If your side, let's say proposition, how do you define what you're proposing or affirming? What do you define as, if we're talking about vaccines, COVID vaccines, you define COVID vaccines and the mandatory part, all that, and you make the motion as a sentence make sense.
All right, I think that's exactly right. And so that's really good. And like we're saying, the resolution could be described with the word motion, like the resolution is a motion. This House believes that, COVID vaccine should be mandatory. So sometimes that is how it's phrased, but however it's phrased, the resolution or the motion or whatever, there are words in that motion or proposition. And what most debate coaches and theorists understand is that the affirmative or the proposition or the House side, they must affirm or agree with the words in that resolution. If they fail to do that, if the affirmative fails to do that, then they have failed fundamentally to earn a vote from the judge. They've lost the debate, is basically what is at issue there. So if the words are misunderstood by the proposition or the House or whatever, the side that's affirming the proposition or the resolution, if they fail to accurately interpret those words, they can lose the entire debate. And so I want to talk about kind of how to, especially when you're the opposition or the negative or going against the House, I want to talk about how to formulate topicality arguments to do that, to cause the affirmative or the proposition to lose. Notice on this slide that there's a Latin term here that topicality is an a priori issue. That's how that word is said, a priori, which means that it comes first. It is a matter of first importance. So, if I said, if we agreed this afternoon, like, okay, we're going to debate the topic of mandatory COVID vaccines, and then all of a sudden, whoever was on the proposition side, they got up and started talking about gun control in the United States or tax policy, like we were talking about at the Coolidge Cup, and they never said anything about COVID vaccines. The opposition would rightly respond and say, you have not defended the proposition. You have not upheld your burden to talk about this proposition about COVID vaccines. You talked about gun control, or you talked about tax policy in the US. That is not the expectation of the resolution. And even if they were very convincing about this other topic, they would still properly lose if the opposition can make the right argument, which is about topicality. And what, at least in the United States, and I think worldwide, you would say is that the proposition is not topical. Or you could say it a little bit more in a straightforward way, that they have not affirmed the proposition. They have not understood its language and its meaning, and therefore they lose the debate. So this is a very important argument. It's a very strategic argument. Now, I've used examples that are fairly extreme and you might think, well, that would never happen. And to a large extent, I think you're right. But I don't think, to be honest, as a debate coach who's done this for 30 years, I don't think opposition teams do enough to try to push the affirmative on what possible errors in understanding the resolution they might have made. So I want to kind of get into the details of that. How do you show, when you're the opposition, that the affirmative or the proposition or the House is not topical? And the fundamental thing you want to prove, the claim you want to make, if we go back to the Toolman model, is that they fail to meet the defined expectations of a word in the resolution. And notice, I'm saying you can be really super specific, for example, like if it's the mandatory vaccine thing, you could define the word mandatory as, without exception required. Okay. Well, if the affirmative stands up and says, well, there's going to be exception to the mandatory nature of the vaccine, you can say, I'm sorry, the definition of mandatory is without exception. So you have failed to successfully defend your burden in this debate, which was to affirm this resolution. You made an exception, so you lose on the word in the proposition, mandatory. So you're going to vote for the opposition today, Judge, because they failed to do that. And it doesn't matter if they've got lots of good evidence about other things. They have failed in that first duty, which was to recognize properly the words of the resolution. So you on the opposition can cause the proposition or the House, however you might want to term it, or in America, we might say the affirmative, to lose a debate by being very specific about a word in the proposition and saying you don't meet that. Now, on the bottom of this slide, I've explained what I think are 3 good elements to put in to an argument against the proposition and a way of proving the topicality argument. And step 1 is to provide a definition. And so, for example, you might say, what does the word mandatory mean according to Oxford English Dictionary or dictionary.com, or you read some evidence that supports a claim that this word means this particular thing, okay? And typically that's gonna come from a source like a dictionary. Then the second thing you're gonna do is say, now, Judge, I've read you that definition. Based on what you just heard in the last speech, when they said mandatory, they had all these exceptions for mandatory. So they're not defending that word, though it's not mandatory. There's exceptions for religious belief and things like that. So it's not mandatory for those people. So I believe, based on what they said in their first opening speech, that they're not topical. They're not defending the resolution. And then, and this is a little bit of the hardest thing, the last thing that might be said is that there are standards for evaluation. You might say, well, you know, we need to use a common man's interpretation of words, or we need to use a dictionary level of words, or we need to use a legal quality source to define this word, or we need to define the word in context, like with other words understood, because sometimes there's multiple meanings for a word, and the only way you can decide the meaning of the word is to look at it within the phrase. So there's sometimes multiple standards for evaluation. How is the judge going to decide, like, that is a fair and reasonable definition of the word? And you need to give guidance on the opposition. And similarly, when you are the proposition, when you are the affirmative, when you are affirming the statement, the resolution, you need to be able to defend in the same 3 areas that I've listed there. You need to have a counter definition, or like, no, mandatory means largely required, not in every case, you know, and you have a counter definition that shows that. And you can explain to the judge, no, we do meet our definition, or maybe we even meet their definition. Let me explain why. And then you provide maybe some different standards for evaluating the question of topicality. I really do think that debaters don't make use of topicality as a form of argument enough, okay? So when you are especially in opposition to someone, do be thinking about what are the specific meanings of the words. And you can get down to some really tedious things, and I think it's okay, like the word "the." You know, if it says make the vaccine mandatory, you know, you could say that that's like a specific one, that the affirmative has a burden to tell us whether Pfizer, Moderna, or Johnson & Johnson is the vaccine, you know, because "the" is a specific particle and it only denotes one. So if they did, hey, any number of vaccines could work, wrong. That's not what the resolution said. They lose on that. So that's a fairly advanced argument technique, but is used. And again, if you think like, well, this is kind of silly or this is not fair, a lot of arguments in law in front of courts stem from this type of argument, an argument about the definition of words. So, for example, right now here in the state of Texas, there's a big debate about whether our governor has the authority to prevent mask mandates. Well, they're having a debate about the meaning of the words in the Texas Constitution in order to figure that out. So the meaning of words can be a very important resource for arguing and debating successfully. So does anybody have a question about topicality as I've described it, or even maybe want to add anything to this?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, what I had was more of like a suggestion, right? So I think a lot of the reasons why as debaters and people are not so prone to using arguments related to, you know, topicality is because they think, well, that's a very huge thing. So attacking that, if they manage to defeat our arguments, our arguments will be moot, right? They'll be nullified. However, I think it's like everything in debate, you have to present layers, right? So it's like one tactic we once used, we were debating and there was a keyword, which was a remedy, right? We're saying that something is a remedy and they were proposing, we were opposing. So when opposing, we were like, first off, let's consider the outer layer. This is our outer layer. We do not believe that they are topical. Then the inner layer is, well, even if you could attack us and prove that it is not, it is quite topical, here are the reasons why, even within the bounds of your definition, you're still wrong, right? So it's better to present as layers and to say, well, this is not true, but even if it was true, here's what is the problem with what you're saying. Yeah, that's what my suggestion is.
Yeah, I like that explanation. And I see Audrey has a hand. Let me just say a little bit first, but the layers of argument, and maybe this is already implied, like, I wouldn't necessarily say that you would only make a topicality argument, for example. You might make multiple arguments, and those might be some of the layers that Benjamin's alluding to. So yeah, and a lot of times, especially when you're in the opposition, you want to come up with multiple ideas that could, and we in America, we oftentimes use the analogy of a boat sinking, and you're just trying to punch a hole in the boat, and whatever argument works to punch that hole, that boat's going to start filling with water and sink if one of those, torpedoes kind of gets into the boat. So the layers of argument, that's a really smart and good way to go about things. Now, Audrey, you had a hand. Do you still have a comment or question about that?
Yeah, as Joel said, in most cases, we fear to use topicality as an argument because we think it's a small thing, right? But the thing that we debaters do not get at a certain point is that debating topicality doesn't mean to debate each and every word in the motion. It means to debate the important words in the motion. For instance, in that debate that Benjamin just talked about, the remedy was the most important word in the motion, and you have to debate you have to even show that that's the most important word. For instance, I have a resolution here that there are no bad dogs, only bad dog owners, right? So in that case, there are different important words for different sides, and you have to first off show the judge how important that word is and use it to your own advantage to even defeat the other side. So if I were on the opposition side, the word only bad dog owners, the word only is really important in that debate to show that it's not just about bad dog owners. You have to prove to them that there is a certain portion of bad dogs that are out there, right? And if you prove that, that nullifies the whole part of only, because you don't just have bad owners, but you can also have bad dogs. So in the end, it's just about what word do you choose and how important is that word in the debate in your favor. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great example and a great analysis there by Audrey. And again, the proposition or the affirmative is well served to provide, as you did, Audrey, what we would call maybe resolution analysis. Like, what does this resolution mean? If you don't do that, then you're going to be very vulnerable to the opposition saying, like, well, they did not define, what this means. So we're going to tell you what it means, and we don't think the proposition has met the burdens of that. So I think that's both of you have made some really good points on that. So that's excellent. Anybody have, I don't know, further questions or comments about arguing the wording of the resolution or the proposition? Okay, well, I think we've only got a few minutes left, maybe 15 minutes left. I think I've still got, oh, and by the way, these are just some topics or resolutions that high school teachers in Rwanda, they brainstormed when I was there in 2019. And I asked the teachers, what do you want to debate? And these were some of the topics that they came up with. And y'all have kind of talked about some other examples already this morning, but we have to be ready for all kinds of different resolutions, things like that. So I won't necessarily get in depth on that. We can come back to that if you want. But you want to understand the resolutions that you're debating. And sometimes they're trickier than they look like. In this particular list, the teachers ended up choosing, I think, the first topic, that Rwanda should have a one-child policy, and we debated that at the Kigali Public Library, and that was their resolution. So it was an interesting topic because Rwanda's population has expanded, but twice as large as it was in 1994. There's about 12 million people that live in Rwanda now. So it's really grown a lot. But all right, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and go forward, though, to the last part, because I do want to leave time for questions further here at the end. But I did have something about understanding the uses of evidence and just kind of go through some elements about evidence, because research is an important part of being a really good debater, and you want to be watching the news and reading news accounts online and things like that to know what is going on. And as our Toolman model even suggested today, the data that we provide, which is really evidence, is important. And so I want to go through some criteria about evaluating evidence so that you can bring the best evidence to your debate, and also maybe criticize your opponent for the weaknesses in their evidence as well. So let's take a look at evidence and some criteria. I think current information is an important factor in evaluating evidence. You know, for example, like on the COVID vaccine, things like that. You know, what we knew about COVID vaccines 3 months ago is very different than what we know about COVID vaccines today. And every day there are new studies about, like here in the United States, and maybe there too, like there's a lot of questions about how well does this vaccine work against the Delta variant? You know, well, that's a question we weren't even really asking 2 months ago. So current information can be really critical. And we might say to an opponent, like, yeah, you're reading evidence from 2 months ago or 6 months ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and it's too old to effectively help us make a decision about this proposition. So the currency of the information or evidence is really important in terms of who should win the debate. So we want to keep that in our minds as we argue. We also want to have relevant citations or sources. And again, when we talk about citations, that is just like, where did this information come from? And, you know, maybe it came from a medical journal, maybe it came from an interview with a doctor if we were looking at COVID issues, but we need to provide relevant citations. And by the way, that can sometimes be a bit of a problem in debate, because the citations we provide orally are different than the ones that we provide in writing in a paper or something like that. So, for example, saying that some evidence came from page 72 of a medical journal, that's not really important. And we don't need to orally say from page 72, volume 7, whatever. Now, I think it would be useful to say Dr. So-and-so, who maybe won a Nobel Prize or the year of the evidence, or maybe even the most current date, like, you know, July 18th, 2021. We want to orally cite anything that would help the judge say, oh, that's good research. I'm impressed. So, and again, we might need to have taken notes about what that source was so that we can orally present it to the judge in a way that is most persuasive. Alternatively, if our opponent is not telling us where the evidence came from, that's a weakness. And we need to highlight for the judge and say, Judge, I've given you very specific citations of my evidence. My opponent is not providing very specific citations of evidence. I think you should prefer my argument because I'm giving you specific evidence that you can go look at yourself. You can find it and discover the independent veracity of what I'm saying, because I'm providing such a good citation and a relevant citation of the material. So again, debaters want to be careful with their time. There's, as I said, time limits in a debate. So you don't want to be overly lengthy with a citation, but you do want to provide relevant information that causes the judge to understand that you did do research and you found specific materials that are relevant to the proposition that the judge is considering. So that's a second important criteria. A special consideration that a lot of debaters don't know, and I've kind of saved this for you all as an advanced technique, is what's called reluctant testimony. And reluctant testimony is a specific kind of evidence where a source supports a claim that is contrary to their own interest. Okay, so when a source supports a claim contrary to their own interest, and again, notice how the language of the Toolman model is sort of being used here. When a source supports a claim contrary to their own interest, that's called reluctant testimony. Like, here in the United States and really around the world, there are different auto manufacturers like the Ford Motor Company, and there's also the General Motors automotive company. If the president of GM, General Motors, came out and in public said, I really like my Ford truck, that would be reluctant testimony. That would be the business owner saying, I like a competitor's product better. If the president of Uganda said, I really like Rwanda's policy on COVID vaccines, that's kind of reluctant testimony, because we might not expect someone from a different country to admire someone else's policy. So we would characterize that as reluctant testimony. That's a special form of evidence that is more compelling than if the president of GM Motors says, I really like GM cars and GM cars are the best. Like, yeah, well, we expect you to say that because you're the president of GM and you want to sell more GM products. So similarly, like with political parties here in the United States, like if a Democrat says they really like a Republican or a Republican says they really like a Democrat, well, that's unusual. And we're going to hold on to that piece of evidence and use it for strategic instance and say, hey, this is reluctant testimony, Judge. You wouldn't expect them to say this. I think that's why you're going to agree with my evidence more than my opponent, because I've got reluctant testimony in today's debate. It's hard to find this evidence, but when you do, you're going to have a lot of extra persuasive power. And then the last thing on my criteria list, and there are other criteria, but these are 4 useful ones, is evidence that's comparative. It sort of says, we could do this or we could do this, but this would be the better option. That's better than just saying, this is a good thing to do. I mean, a judge is trying to compare options in a real world, okay? And just saying that something by itself in a vacuum is good doesn't tell me whether the trade-offs might make that thing actually a bad thing. So when the evidence actually compares, like, well, we could do this or this, or maybe even 3 options, like, or like the vaccines, like, well, actually this vaccine's gonna work the best, so we're going to prefer that. When the evidence is comparative in nature, that's better than evidence that just endorses something alone in a vacuum without making comparisons to the status quo, the way things are now versus how they would be. That kind of comparative analysis is very strong. And when we have sources doing that, we want to draw the attention of the judge to that. I'll also say, if the format of debate allows it, if you're able to read evidence like from a source, I don't think it's wrong to read a quotation directly from a piece of paper as a way of saying, this is accurate. This is exactly what the doctor said or the politician said. And then, look back at the judge and say, Judge, I think this is important evidence because, but looking at that piece of paper can say, okay, this is accurate information that I'm conveying to you. So we're nearly at the end of our 2 hours here. And so I want to stop and allow you all to ask your own questions about anything about debate that maybe you wanted me to cover and I didn't. I've also put my email on the screen there so that if you ever want to send me an email so that I can respond to you or help you, I would be happy to do that. But we've got about 10 minutes left here, I think, on the schedule. And I just want to see if anybody has some questions that they want to ask, or even maybe make more comments or advice. Y'all are giving very good instruction on your own. And again, there don't have to be questions or anything, but once again, I'm very impressed with the experience level and the advice that you all are giving, even on this call. I think you're doing really well with your debate understanding and things like that. And really, like I say on the slide here, if you have questions in the future, I'm happy to look at something through email. or even to set up these Zoom calls and things like that we've done. Especially if you have, a specific resolution that you want to work with or something like that, I'd be happy to kind of help you all in depth. But I hope this afternoon you've kind of got a deeper understanding of how, especially debate coaches and debate directors, look at arguments in a deep way and trying to get at some of the techniques that advanced debaters use, especially here in the United States, but I think around the world, to win their debate cases. But y'all have been a good class today. Is there anything else I can do to help you? At this point, I probably kind of will turn it over to Audrey to kind of say or clarify whatever else we should do or pursue in this conversation.
So thank you so much, Dr. Ben. It has been nice to have you here, as though it's virtual. I just wanted to tell each and everyone who is on this call to be able to understand that whatever just was said, it was all for your own good, all right? So the reason why I called out help from Ben is because of the competitiveness that we've seen in many debate tournaments around the globe. Rwanda isn't any exception, and I'd like to invite you all to understand that if a judge tells you, I'm not giving you the debate because you lacked warrant, to not be confused, all right? If a judge is talking about other stuff, other debate terms, because we are moving more into advanced debating, do not be confused, all right? So that's the major goal of today. It was to be able to introduce young debaters in Rwanda to, various words that are used when it comes to advanced debate and different theories or different techniques that are used in order for you to understand, advanced debate. I would like to thank Dr. Ben for doing such a marvelous, job to helping us understand all that. It's been my pleasure to have you. It's been our pleasure as Rwandan debaters to have you, and we hope that the tournaments that are going to be more that are coming up are the ones that allow us to have that space to understand more of this, to have the space to understand what debate has to impact in a society and what it has to impact in our own lives. All right, so he talked about to have a reason to debate, but debate can also have a reason to impact you. All right, so if you don't have a reason to debate, then do have a reason for debate to impact you. All right, so let's all be able to understand what a dropped argument is, what a claim is, what a warrant is, and all that stuff. And I hope you'll be better debaters by understanding all this stuff, but at the same time better impactful people in your own societies. So yes, thank you so much for joining us today. I think that concludes our session.